All right. Good morning, or I suppose good evening. I have my friend Odysseus here. I'm very, very pleased to have him on the Substack and hopefully also on the YouTube. Been going back and forth for a little while now, so it's a pleasure to have you. Pleasure to speak with you.
It's a
Would you
pleasure
like
to
to
be
introduce
here.
yourself to? Thank you. Thank you for coming up. Would you like to introduce yourself to the people?
Sure thing. Yes, my name is Odysseus. I'm a Dzogchen practitioner. I also study mindfulness, my master's in the studies of mindfulness. And other than that, I have a great interest in Neoplatonic theurgy and Tantric practice.
It's off the bat. I can see how you did. You find mindfulness before you found the Neoplatonic and the Tantra, or did that come afterwards?
That's a tricky question because the thing is, Neoplatonic theurgy is so much embedded
Hmm.
overtly into the Christian practices, especially in the practices of the Eastern Orthodox liturgy, where
Hmm.
I think it's more accurate to say I'm more was familiar first with Neoplatonic theurgy, although at
Hmm.
that time, obviously, I did not know consciously until that was the
Right.
case. Yet, if we are to speak from a strict perspective, how the sequence of the events unfolded, I
Hmm.
guess I was first acquainted with mindfulness, secular mindfulness to be more exact. Had an
Hmm.
interest in phenomenology and also the advancements of cognitive science. And
Hmm.
at a later time, I got more involved in the esoteric contemplative practices of theurgy and its
Hmm.
derivatives in the Western tradition.
Well, that makes it. I could see exactly how that would be a bit of a tricky question because they kind of arise mutually, and then it would seem like you've sort of stitched them together as you've been on your path. I
Yeah,
wanted to start
it's
with.
very interesting because,
Mhm.
you know, especially when it comes to traditions which have multiple of centuries of layers and advancements, they
Right.
become so much embedded within culture and religious practices that
Hmm.
it's a non-conscious process, their presence within culture and within religiosity. The Orthodox liturgy is basically a theurgy with Christian
Hmm.
symbolism, and the doctrines of the Trinitarian doctrines, especially of
Hmm.
apophatic Christianity, is more or less Neoplatonic mysticism covered in the robes, let's say, of
Right.
the Christian developments of Europe.
Right. It's so funny that you say that, right? Because one of the things that, to your point, it kind of it becomes the atmosphere. It becomes such a way of almost being and just participating in whatever culture, particularly in Europe, that you might be a part of. That you're practicing ancient forms of traditions and rites and symbolism that you couldn't even recognize. It's just so part of the fabric of being. And I
Yeah,
wanted to
they are
start.
active, but they are
Mhm.
active in ways that most people don't understand. They are
Absolutely.
non-conscious to it.
Well, and I think one of the things that I enjoy so much about your work, and I'm sure that we'll get into it where we intersect a lot, is about the nature of relationship. So if
Mhm.
you are engaging in it, it really can be anything, honestly, that depending on your degree of relationship and your conscious, oh, I don't want to necessarily say conscious awareness, but your mindfulness, as you say, mindfulness awareness to what you are practicing, you then have a degree of change that you can actually invoke as a result of that. But if you're not aware of what's going on, you lose really any chance of having that sort of transformative change. You know what I mean?
Oh, yes, of course, and not only that, there are some, let's say, possible side effects.
Hmm.
Even with secular mindfulness practice, there are possible things that may happen which can be considered as adverse effects if there is
Right.
no framework for integration. And
Yes.
if you go on to see how esoteric practices may have adverse
Hmm.
effects, without that framework of understanding,
Right.
then you can have really, really bad effects, even psychotic events. and these things are
Absolutely.
documented in contemplative traditions, both in the West and in the East. That's
Right.
why it's so paramount, and that's one of my main points of my work. It's a paramount to connect with a living lineage, to connect
Right.
with people, especially very experienced individuals that can be said to be teachers, either
Right.
officially or unofficially, that can guide you through some inner experiences, which in some cases, if you don't have this interpersonal connection, it can lead
Hmm.
to very bad things. Um, events of awakening, they do not have much difference phenomenologically speaking from
Hmm.
psychotic events or events of bipolar disorders. That the line is very blurred, and
Very much
whether
so.
you are experiencing something pathological or an event of samadhi, a flash of
Yeah.
insight,
Yeah.
it all comes down to whether, well, first and foremost, neurobiologically, your brain and
Hmm.
nervous system can integrate this successfully and do not overload into self-destruction. And
Yes.
of course, the conceptual interpretive framework to have a philosophy that can withhold such experiences,
Right.
and somebody with the actual presence of the one who has walked the path to reassure you that things are going to be okay. Keep walking on.
That is that is such an important aspect in many ways, particularly being able to walk with somebody that has already walked the path that you're looking to be on. As you mentioned, having the nervous system is so primary that if you do not have the capacity to withhold the transformation, it will end up as pathological. And I've sort of came at something similar in my own work, that I wrote a symbolic study on Friedrich Nietzsche, and he has
Mhm.
a very clear recurring theme throughout his life of Wotan, and you see it in a lot of his poems. You see the motif of the huntsman, the thunder, the lightning, and the wind in particular. He self-identifies with the wind. These types of
Mhm.
motifs, and
These are
he
very
does not
inspiring,
have.
by the way. These
Pardon me.
verses, these excerpts from Nietzsche's work are very inspiring, very powerful. They have a living
Extremely.
human into them. Yes, you just read them and
You,
something
you
almost
you can
possesses
feel it in them. That's it. That is a that you said it better, me. That you can feel it in your body when you read it off the page. Like it has its own spirit. It animates you. But the problem that obviously he later ran into in his later life, that there was no capacity for integration, that Jung also
you. Yeah.
talks about. So
Mhm.
he suffers the psychological inflation because there's no path to walk, and obviously he sets up most of his life in opposition to things, and almost in defiance that he won't be told, which is part of the problem, that there's no, as you say, there's no capacity for integration to be able, and the line of the genius, the words just, exploding off the page versus complete psychosis, extremely thin, you know.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
And
yeah.
what Nietzsche did, you know, Nietzsche didn't say some good things about Plato and Socrates, which
Hmm.
for me are like very important figures for my work.
Hmm.
Nonetheless, I believe that regardless what one holds as philosophical principle or beliefs, one
Hmm.
must respect Nietzsche. He is the
Yes.
prophet of modernity and postmodernity. His
Absolutely.
life, what he went through, what he experienced, what he put into words, is a work of paramount importance. You cannot ignore it. You can hate it if you want, but you cannot
Right.
not to respect it.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I really do find Nietzsche fascinating. I haven't read all of his works, but Thus
Hmm.
Spoke Zarathustra was definitely one of the most inspiring pieces of literacy I have ever read.
Hmm.
And he does have an influence on my work. You've seen how I often talk about how the integration of theurgy
Yes.
and Tantra, in which I believe we can identify a perennial phenomenology of awakening. And it is perennial not because the doctrines are the same. Don't get me
Yep.
wrong there. Doctrines are different. There are
Right.
vital differences between those traditions when it comes to the interpretations of reality and the ontological frameworks.
Hmm.
Nonetheless, it is perennial because consciousness is perennial. Consciousness is
Right.
universal, and the felt experience of awakening to the true nature of the mind
Hmm.
cannot be different in principle because of different doctrines. And this
Right.
is where I'm
Exactly.
looking at between the, let's say, syncretism and the comparative analysis of theurgy and Tantra, is that if we examine those traditions carefully, we can identify some of those perennial phenomenological signs of
Right.
awakening to true reality, which also includes, for example, the imaginal, coming into communion with the symbols, the synthemata, as Iamblichus will have it,
Yes.
that are embedded within the manifested world, and awakens the latent capacity of the psyche to recollect, existentially
Yes.
recollect how things truly are, and liberate itself from the cycle of generation. And through that investigation of the perennial phenomenology of awakening, you can
Hmm.
say, and that's my interpretation, right? I'm not
Right.
a
Of
Nietzsche
course.
scholar. Don't get me wrong. My
Right.
interpretation is we can display the overman,
Yes. Yes.
because through that understanding of the phenomenology of awakening, we
Hmm.
can have new modes of being in the world, and that's what's, from in my perspective, the overman is all about.
Yeah.
Forging new modes of being in the world, something that is vital, something that is alive, it is not dead. Because
Right.
something which is said as a fixed structure over the centuries, that is dead. And
Right.
the West right now is full of dead corpses, full of dead gods, full of dead ideologies. And the madness of it is that we Westerners, we grasp on those dead bodies, these
Yes.
dead gods, and do not
Yes.
move on.
We were very commit. One that is one. There's two things you said there. One on the grasping of the dead corpses that litter us. But I want to take it just back very briefly on your comment about symbols and the latent capacity that symbols have. It's something that I've been covering in my own work of
Mhm,
the amount of unique symbolism and personal symbols and also transpersonal symbols that recur through people's lives that are the they're the generative capacity that you have, and if you ignore them, they are equally as destructive. So, for
mhm,
example, Jung, I was just writing on his work as a project that I'm working on, and one of the things that you see throughout all of his work is the latent feminine and the anima, this type of quality that seeps through all of his work. The Great Mother, Sophia,
mhm,
when he's talking about all of these types of things, the letter to Job piece, and these types of things, that this is something that is so recurring, and is so present in all of his works that it animates his work and is part of what makes him him as he leans sort of more into that idea. So to your point about the animating of corpses, that the reawakening or re enlivening of certain symbols and certain symbolic frameworks gives you the opportunity to sort of inject the life back into the society. Now, conversely, what you have to do is obviously scrape out the old. You can't build life on top of death. It doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, you have to clear the forest first, let everything sort of burn a little bit, and then that gives you the capacity for new generative ideas. And so, one of the things that I loved very very much, and I enjoy about your work a lot, is that is the practicality of it, that not just because many people practice, and you've written about it in your work, that people practice or learn theurgy or tantra or whatever might be the case as an abstraction. They think that the knowing of it or the knowing about it is enough to facilitate some sort of change. But one of the things that I absolutely enjoy while reading your work is the necessity of the embodied practice, that you cannot facilitate the change in mere abstraction. So if you'd like to add on to that a little bit, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, if one is to be a theurgic practitioner or a tantric practitioner, embodiment is a must. You cannot be truly a tantric practitioner without applying those principles into your direct practice. And
Hmm.
there are stages to that. The first
Right.
stage is to sit down on your cushion and
Hmm.
recite sadhana or do a theurgic invocation, and that is your theurgic or tantric practice, right?
Hmm.
Then the next stage would be to connect with the subtle body or the luminous vehicle, the avoides όχημα in Neoplatonic theurgic terms. That is more
Hmm.
subtle because it does require grounding perception in
Hmm.
what we now call, in modern terms, in the autonomic nervous system, in the workings of the autonomic nervous system, which does
Yes.
require some sort of refinement of attention. And then let's say the third stage, although this is not an official teaching, I'm just conceptualizing, simplifying those
Right.
conceptual frameworks. The third stage would be taking on theurgy and tantra as not something that is done simply formally. I'm sitting down, I'm doing an invocation, or I'm sitting down and I'm doing a breathing exercise to connect with the subtle body. But
Hmm.
it is the connection that those set forces are always active. There's no actual boundary between tantric and theurgic practice with
Right.
everything else happening in your life, with what is happening right now between us, for example. The
Right.
fact
Exactly.
that everything is intelligible, that we can be understood, we are speaking a language, there are vibrations interexchanging right now between us and whoever is going to listen to this podcast. The fact that this
Yep.
is intelligible and a manifested world is the appearance of what we would say in theurgy of the gods, or
Right.
as we would say in tantric vocabulary of the wisdom deities, of the yidams.
Hmm. That
So
is
for me,
this.
that's the embodiment is taking those principles and connecting with them throughout your everyday life. And that's where you want to get at with theurgic and tantric practice.
This is, and I agree obviously, I agree very much. And my work comes from a bit of a different direction, but along the same lines that you are a part of the process. There's no part in the process that ceases to then and separates you from out of the process. That if you are in nature, nature is total. It is completely totalizing. So if we're sitting here and having a conversation, as you say, and there's the vibrations, there's the resonance, there's the tonal aspects, there's the biological aspects for those that listen, those will also be affected, etc., etc. There is no then abstraction point in which I can stop being part of the sort of relational aspects and then take myself out of that. And so to be, and again, this is to your studies of mindfulness here, that to be mindful of the very fact that process in again, in my view, and in the work that I do, that the process is always ongoing and it's always alive. You don't get to remove yourself from the process at any point. You just locate yourself at another point in time along sort of the spectrum, or along the conceptual web, if you will. So I agree
Yeah,
very
and
much.
just to add to that, I'm sorry, just to add to that,
Mhm.
both theurgy and tantra, they have an understanding of ultimacy that is dynamic, in the
Mhm.
sense that yes, the ultimate nature of things is unchanging, but
Mhm.
because they have teachings of emanationism, that
Mhm.
emanation, that ineffable, unchanging um, presence, the divine nature, is
Yep.
always dynamically emanating the untemporal here and now.
Right. That is, I want to touch on that and the nature of temporality, and I want to talk about in particular. I was very interested when I was reading the work, and it was one of the things that I wrote down to ask you is the mantra mudra material and the idea of tonal entrainment. So obviously, as part of both practices, is a auditory and a harmonic um, aspect. These are both central to both of the practices. So what I think about harmonics, and I've been trying to hold sort of a distinction between harmonics as physical and resonating in the body, which is obviously measurable and real and mechanical in that sense, and then harmonics as pure ratio, as relationship that doesn't have a physical sort of touch here and there, but more structural than acoustic. So when we're talking about resonating and operating through all levels, I'm curious which register you mean, or whether you think that that distinction even holds up as you talk about emanation and continuity like that.
Well, mantras work not because they sound in a particular way.
Hmm.
That's not the source of causality that makes a mantra work to
Hmm.
have a particular effect, or if we are to use the Neoplatonic theurgic term, the use of ineffable names.
Hmm.
So they do not work because of the physical vibration. They
Right.
work because they make they make manifest to us material beings that which is beyond essence, that which is beyond sound. It encompasses sound, but it is
Hmm.
not bound by it. And to make
Okay.
this more clearly, it is useful to have in mind the hierarchical causal framework of
Hmm.
Neoplatonism, in which there is the one, the ineffable
Hmm.
one, and then there
Hmm.
is a downstream of causality from the suprasensible realities, from the very, very abstract, such as limit and the unlimited,
Hmm.
down to the sound of a mouth that is speaking. And
Right.
in that sense, a divine name, let's say Apollon,
Hmm.
why does it have a divine potency? Is it within the sound Apollon itself?
Hmm.
No, not from the Neoplatonic theurgic perspective. It is rather that force that is beyond the physical that is made manifest into the sound. But the thing
Okay.
is that just to make this a bit more understandable,
Hmm.
although there is an ontological priority of the
Hmm.
suprasensible realities of divinities, those divinities are not completely separated from the physical sound itself, because in the Iamblichian theurgic worldview, you cannot
Hmm.
separate form and essence. You cannot separate that which is supracosmic with the cosmic. That is a
Right.
dualistic framework that does not go in the Platonic tradition, which is henological. It is
Right.
oneness. So there is a distinction in causal priority, and that which causes an effect, it is not bound by its effect. So the supracosmic form is not bound by the sound, but nonetheless, it is tied to the sound.
Okay.
And
I see
from a
what you mean.
Tantric perspective, just to give the Tantric perspective as well, they do
Hmm.
understand similarly as theurgy why mantras work. Yet their understanding of why their work is more immediate. They do not, most of Tantric traditions, they do not adopt such a hierarchical causal framework that Neoplatonists do. But
Hmm.
it's quite similar in action because they do not say that the sound itself produces the effects. They're not materialists. And this kind of dualistic understanding of reality, they do not have a place in the tantric worlds, in the worlds that Tantra emerged. So there was not
Hmm.
such a distinction to begin with, because they understood that speech itself is the direct appearance of primordial
Hmm.
awareness. There's no differentiation between the primordial awareness and its appearance as sound. And just to add something final to this, all that in theory is all good, yet
Hmm.
I understand why one might have an objection of, okay, this is just mumbo jumbo theory. Um,
Hmm.
skeptics, I would like to say that there are actual scientific findings, which are quite rigorous at this point, that certain vibrations do affect the nervous system in very particular ways. There is a
Hmm.
reason why all religious traditions of the world encompass humming, for example, in their hymns,
Yeah.
because it does have an effect in the parasympathetic nervous system, more specifically in the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system,
Hmm.
which in turn is related to the sensations of feeling safe, integrated, and connected. So,
Right.
from a very, very strict materialistic perspective, we do know this, if one wants to be completely skeptic about it.
Right.
Now, from a more direct experience perspective, my experience
Hmm.
is that all sounds, to a certain degree, they have, let's say, some sort of a magical effect. And
Right.
Plato, in his analysis of language, was able to identify this. And he first wrote that, for example, that vowels that tend
Hmm.
to express the unlimited or that which is beyond limitation, such as the indefinite dyad, the
Hmm.
spaciousness of reality, or the ineffable oneness. That's why the Greek alphabet begins with alpha, A,
Hmm.
and the consonants, they express the limitation of the infinitude of this spaciousness of reality, which is beyond determination. And intuitively, I don't know how much this makes sense in modern linguistics, but intuitively, for me, it does
Hmm.
make sense. And in my practice, I could feel an immediate bodily effect with the use of mantras just because of the vibrations and all that. Yet,
Right.
when attention also connects with a suprasensible presence from which sound arises, so when
Hmm.
attention is defined and connects with the gaps between thoughts, the gaps
Yeah.
between the arisings of energies, then you do get a direct sense of sacredness in each sound, and especially the sacred names of mantras and the
Hmm.
ineffable names of Iamblichi and theurgy.
Well, it's again, and I, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, primarily because in my again, I'm coming to the a similar perspective once again from an opposite direction that I believe that sound and harmony and ratio and acoustics to be ontologically primary. I think that the body internalizes and reacts without conscious thought, either in stress or complete relaxation, without the knowledge whatsoever of what it is that it is hearing. And you look at the harmonic and ratio principles; these extend to beauty, they extend to nature, they extend to architecture, and they also extend to mantras, as you've said here. So the a vibration, whatever that vibration might be, is just, and I don't want to say is just, but something like a octave or a fifth is an objective mathematical presence. It simply exists. It is. That's the most I can say about it. It is. And so when you engage with these things that are primary and structural, you can then invoke particular changes in the body. So I think for people that are skeptical at this point on the um, impact or influence or the legitimacy of vibration is very, very naive. As you've said there, the amount of literature and scholarship that has been dived into, as you mentioned there, on things like the vagus nerve or putting people into the fight flight system through using. I mean, even at the most basic level, if you watch a horror movie, the score is designed for you to have a physiological effect without anything changing. So it would stand to reason that if you can hear the Jaws theme song and feel tense and anxious, then there is a set of auditory vibrations that either you can perform yourself or be in the presence of that could then produce the more positive effects. And so I'm in absolute agreement that, and when we go back to the topic of relationship, in my view, it's the getting back to the center of relating to these sort of underlying primary aspects. I think to say that the sound om, for example, is produced, it's not the the structure of Om. It's the vibration and what that means and what that's doing to release a sort of strain in the body. You know.
Well, the Saivic branch of Tantra
Hmm.
does have a whole cosmology based on vibrations, on spanda, that basically everything that
Hmm.
appears is a result of the subtle vibration of Sakti. And that vibration is the reflexive response of
Hmm.
Shiva, primordial consciousness.
Okay.
So there is something interesting into that, especially since modern physics and
Right.
philosophy of the mind slowly enters into the domains where, curiously enough, materialistic monism is abundant, and
Hmm.
consciousness is being examined, at least the possibility of it, as being
Hmm.
primary to space time and matter.
Yes.
And in that sense, if there are breakthroughs in that field, and I do hope that eventually I'm going to directly participate in the advancements of these new studies into consciousness, we
Hmm.
might get into a new, completely modern and scientific framework where vibration, some sort of vibration, is seen throughout all manifestations of the cosmos,
Hmm.
grounded into non-dual consciousness, consciousness as such.
Right. Well, it's to that point. Um, judging by, are you familiar with Ian McGilchrist? Judging, you seem like you are, judging by how you write and what I've read.
I am familiar with him, but
Hmm.
I don't have a deep understanding of his work. But I am
Hmm.
familiar uh, in a more superficial level of his writings.
Well, so to his work and the hemispheric hypothesis, one of the things that he posits is that that relationship is primary, and so in my view, to the point that you just made, that the fundamental element of consciousness is a relational capacity. It is relational. All consciousness does is the mediation between here and there. It's how you can even determine between here and there. There's a branch of mathematical philosophy called ontic structural realism, and the idea is that structures are primary to things in space. That you don't necessarily even have things in space, but rather you have the structure that allows for them to exist. Now, the second question that you run into when you posit that is, well, then how do things even exist at all if there's just structures? So that then opens the door to at least what I've started to formulate as a very, very um, basic answer. It's very amateur at this point in my development, but the mediating factor, as you've just said, between what would be structural and the objects out in space would then be the consciousness. It in my view, I don't see how it could be any other way. That you can see as through lived experience, there seems to be or feels to be that there are independent objects out there. However, they don't arise of their own, and they arise as part of a much broader structure of who can point to the source, I'm not sure. However, what even becomes an object or our conception of an object is completely mediated by that consciousness. So I'm eager to sort of see that development, because if you then go one layer above that and you're getting now to the point of vibration, well, what is what is consciousness's role in either uh, transmuting or understanding vibration? These are the questions that I have. Obviously, I don't I don't know the answer, but that is
About
what I'm.
the first thing that you mentioned, I would really suggest for you to dive more deeply into Platonism. I'm not trying to
Please.
convert you into Platonism, but the thing is,
Hmm.
these are questions which have been examined thoroughly in the dialogues
Hmm.
of Plato. And what I do like about Plato is that
Yeah.
he never wrote down a philosophical system, and he explicitly states in one of the letters that we have preserved of him that he
Hmm.
intentionally never wrote down his true philosophy. You only have
Right.
hints in the dialogues, and it inspires that reorientation of the soul to seek its suprasensible origins and
Right.
knowledge. So, reading through the dialogues of Plato, although one cannot have strict philosophical system out of that, it does
Hmm.
raise this ignition of thought to really dive deep into insights. And
Hmm.
in Platonism, broadly speaking, you have unity as being primary.
Right.
Unity as in the transcendence of the separation of subject and object, and that is
Okay.
completely ineffable. The right next thing to that ineffability is consciousness. It is unified, but as you
Hmm.
said, it is still very subtly relational. We
Yeah.
mentioned about consciousness being self-reflexive, primordial
Hmm.
consciousness, that is not mundane consciousness.
Hmm.
And through that, Platonism would state that primordial consciousness mathematizes, like projects mathematics and
Yes.
geometry into space, into
Yeah.
indeterminate space that is beyond the category of existing and non existing, of being
Hmm.
that or this. And through that projection of the forms, which are
Hmm.
then manifested as mathematics, as geometry, as musical harmony. Keep in mind that Plato
Hmm.
was Pythagorean in many ways. He went to
Right.
Sicily and received Pythagorean doctrines, and you can see subtle aspects in his works of Pythagoreanism, although he never
Right.
directly stated that he adopts Pythagorean doctrines. So, musical harmonies are also very important into uh, the works of Platonism.
Right.
So, I really suggest for you to look into that more deeply because it would possibly complete your framework, make it um, more refined.
And it's very funny that you say that because my entire background on this line of thought was completely in reverse. I started with the question of, well, what would need to be true for this to be true? And then I reasoned backwards from first principles that the only structures that I could see for my own questions, because I was very skeptical, but I was very interested in the question of astrology. That why would this system persist for 4, 5, 6,000 years if there is absolutely nothing to it? And so, as sort of a exercise, that's where I started. And so, as I was going through my questioning, that was the only conclusion that I could logically come to as how is it that anything can be perceived that is independent of the observer, that there has to be something that exists and persists across the universe that is independent of my own waking consciousness. And so mathematics, and which is the primary, and then geometry and harmonics and acoustics, which are then they're just the angular relationships of the mathematics, then produce tangible form, or at least audible experience
Yes, but,
at
but just
the
to add
minimum.
to that, it's very important to understand that in the henological framework of Platonism, and especially
Hmm.
later Neoplatonism, those mathematics and geometrical objects and the forms that precede them methodologically are
Hmm.
not out there. They are not objects in some
Right.
second universe. And I'm stating this because by the gods, Plato has
Hmm.
been misread so much by so many people, even scholars, that it is
Yep.
baffling. And when you go into his works directly, you understand
Hmm.
much of the critiques that you're reading of Plato are
Hmm.
not directed to Plato's actual work. It is as if they're talking about a different philosophy. And I've heard
Right.
many people, yeah, that they went into Platonism having some ideas of what Platonism is from commentaries or what they read online, and then
Right.
they read, for example, about hora. Hora is the ontological term of Plato for spaciousness and how it is indeterminate, how it cannot be categorized. And they say, okay, this is
Hmm.
this Plato. And then they read the dialogue Parmenides and they have the nine hypotheses of the one. And it
Hmm.
ends with a complete agnosticism. And within that very same dialogue, it dismantles the idea of the forms being objects. It
Right.
is
Exactly.
Plato dismantling the very theory of forms, but
Right.
nonetheless, Plato never abandoned the form. So it makes you think, what does he mean by that? And
Right.
obviously, what Plato means is not that forms like or mathematics, there are objects out there, and
Hmm.
this is how you see the truth. And it's very funny because there are modern mathematical philosophies.
Hmm.
Don't recall the names right now, but someone can look this up. That they are
Hmm.
based in those Plato, this understanding of Plato, this
Hmm.
misunderstanding of Plato, to be more exact, and they're trying to figure out the truth of reality as if I can find I don't know an equation floating somewhere or as something that can will bring me the
Exactly.
truth. While Plato never wrote this. He actually states in the Republic that mathematics, geometry, even musical harmonies, as you have mentioned in this
Hmm.
interaction, uh,
Yeah.
they work as reorienters. They reorient the soul from the grasping to the sensible world, which is always in flux. And Plato states
Right.
that if you grasp into that, good luck, you will end up suffering, which is actually
Right.
the very same principle the Buddha taught, right? So
Right. Exactly.
use musical harmonies and elevate your impulse for desire called
Hmm.
eros in the Orchum for something more worthwhile. And perhaps when you go through those levels of eros, through the musical harmonies, through geometry, through mathematics, through philosophy, perhaps then a fire will suddenly burst forth, will ignite as a
Right.
direct flash of insight, and you will see the good directly. And this is a hyper rational event. So Plato was a mystic in actuality.
Right.
He was a rational mystic, a scientist, but first and foremost, a mystic.
Right. Well, and to that point, I think in you and you're free to correct me if I'm wrong, but the I read your work, and that is the direction that I think should be tended towards the rational mystic, the scrutinizing philosopher. That there's this balance that can be struck between having the rational mind, the inquisitive mind, looking to turn over every stone, look under everything, scrutinize mathematically, and then also still and then sort of take that and nest it inside the broader mystic, the broader event. That in a lot of my own work, I've moved away from the idea of causal frameworks and mechanism. I don't find it to be true really in any large scale or any significant scale really, and that many things work because you are a part of the process, as you've mentioned. The one, you are part of the ineffable source rather than you are an abstracted individual away. That music is not necessarily important because music exists as something over there, but you are made from the exact same individual source internally and you resonate with it. You correspond to it rather than it is causing you to do something. It's, I think that's the most also egregious reading of astrology, and is you see it a lot in horoscopes that, well, you're a Leo, so that must mean X, Y, and Z. But I don't think that's all the case. I think that you are, I mean, from a strictly materialist perspective, you have developed from the exact same event that planets are made of. You are made from the exact same timeline, from in the exact same way, from the exact
We
same
have literal
developmental process.
kinship to the planets and the stars.
Pardon me?
We have a literal kinship with the planets and the stars.
and not in a, and this is not me being wearing a mystical hat. It is in the very literal sense that
Yeah,
the way
exactly.
Earth,
Purely from a materialistic perspective, you also have like Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's, the
yeah,
famous astrophysicist. He
right,
does platonize or have a little bit of a religious flair when he says that, but it does
right,
stand scrutiny, no matter how much of a skeptic one wants to be.
yeah. You can be as skeptical of it as you like. It is an ironclad fact. You cannot get around it. So you then have to ask the secondary question was, well, if that is not even if that's the case, because that is the case, what does that mean? In what, and again back to our sort of central question here, how do we stand in relationship to that fact that there is an individual ineffable source that you are a node in along the a process, you are along the path of this developmental process, and the
You
West
speak with
has
it.
done,
This is what you do. You begin
yeah,
speaking with it.
right. And that's all you can do. You have to get in.
Yeah.
You have to get into relationship with it because you can't run from it. You can't hide from it. You're in the game. You're a part of the process. And so one of again, I'll keep saying it, that one of the things I enjoy most about your work is the rites and initiations and rituals are not these mystical over there practices. They are the most practical, down to earth, sensible thing that you can do because
Mhm.
you are a part of this incredible holistic event that you must be in dialogue with. You're in dialogue with it whether you know it or not. So to be
Yeah,
conscious of it is the most important thing.
rituals, if they are sound, based in rational principles, are
Exactly.
actually the most wholesome act, perhaps, a man can do,
I would agree.
because it integrates all the forces of the human psyche, the instinctual, the rational, and the super rational, into one action.
That is exact. It is for the. I find it very ironic that the skeptics who stand on the other side of the argument, who put this down to some sort of um, mysticism or some sort of quackery, I really can't wrap my head around it because you're engaging every single material sense that you could name unified towards a particular goal, all of which are or can be confirmed to be affected in that way. Your own doctrines and your own line of thought confirms this, and then you simultaneously will turn around and dismiss the idea. So, I
Yeah, well,
agree
to play the
very, very
devil's
much.
advocate, and some of the skeptics they have merit in their arguments is that, as I said before, if the philosophical principles are not sound when you
Yes.
conduct a theurgic ritual or a tantric sadhana, when someone is not familiar with mathematics, geometry, these kinds of, let's say, poles of discriminating wisdom, it
Hmm.
is easy for one to get lost into the magical aura of such rituals and
Right.
develop certain beliefs about reality which are not um, based in actual reality. And think of, for example, many of the New Age currents, although
Yes.
I believe many of the phenomena described by New Age practitioners, individuals, they do have merit. They need to be examined. They do indicate to something more than just us being matter and the universe being a materialistic universe.
Hmm.
Nonetheless, the interpretations they have of certain events, they are suspect to whether they are actual or not. And one thing that
Right.
comes to mind is channeling, for example. They will
Yep.
say X entity from another dimension appeared and led me to write certain things. And
Right.
well, how do you prove that? There are other explanations to that, right? So it's a very specific statement of a phenomenon. Nobody disputes the
Right.
phenomenon, but when you give this type of interpretation, this causal relationship, I think it stands the scrutiny of examination. At
I
least
agree.
it is not something that one ought to grasp into it without further evidence. And I believe this is where skeptics come in and say that, okay, this is all a bunch of bullshit. Like, what are you doing, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
they miss the mark of the more deeper argument that I believe you and I are making, that
Hmm.
these practices, at least in their highest initiatic form, not in the
Hmm.
low religious expressions or the new age practices, they are
Hmm.
tied to the perennial primary consciousness, consciousness as such,
Right.
consciousness as the base of our manifested world, because no world exists that appears and can be known outside of consciousness. And that
Absolutely.
phenomenologically, it cannot be overturned. And ontologically, it is something to be studied whether, as I said earlier, whether consciousness is actually primary to space-time.
Right. Well,
And
the
that's the
and
deeper argument.
that, that is an incredibly one interesting question, and two difficult question to answer. I lean on the side that it exists outside of space time, and I think that well, they've tried to do tests to be able to do that, but the problem with that is that you have to exist within space time to be able to sort of posit that in the first place. So you
Yeah.
sort of run into a bit of a tricky problem. Now you have such things as like the remote viewers and things like that, but again, if you're a skeptic, it's like how can you possibly corroborate that? And I think when if we go back to Plato, that the intuition, the mystic qualities that are positing something more than just material, mixed with the rationalistic and the skepticism and the rigor to really test those things. Because I think the people who have the intuition that there's something more have an implicit sort of fear that, well, if I really inspect my beliefs, it's all going to be crumbling down. But what I've actually found is that if you really interrogate your own beliefs, you actually find something much stronger and much more interesting than whatever sort
It does
of
require courage and maturity to do that.
it
Not,
takes a
not,
lot of courage,
yeah, yeah.
a
And
lot of courage.
not many people, especially nowadays, what I can see, has this innate drive to do such an examination.
Right. And I think once again that your work is it starts with the people that are courageous. You have to play the game at 100%. You don't there's no option. I suppose that's kind of a broader rule of life that there's no option to not participate. And so you have to go in and really interrogate what is out there and be afraid to be incorrect or
You
be
can
foolish or
ignore
be
it
wrong.
for
Yeah,
some time. You can ignore it, but then things happen, and death being the most powerful reminder of, hey,
right.
there's something
Yeah,
here
right.
that needs to be
Right.
seen, right? And I'm not saying death in the sense of fear of dying, but
Yeah.
rather that at the very least you get a knock on your door, and you get notified very strongly that things are impermanent, and that is a wake up call
Absolutely.
to perhaps, okay, some things which I may hold as true, some beliefs which may restrain me, are not
Right.
beneficial. Perhaps they are worth to be re-examined.
And I think that's I I always take death as sort of the greatest pressure because we all know it's lurking behind every corner. We all like to ignore it. It sits in the corner, sort of staring at us from time to time, and it may be a friend, might be a friend of a friend, somebody that you work with, and it sort of snaps you back into reality of getting back
Mm.
onto the path. I know that for myself, there's been people that have passed away in my life, and I start to take my life a lot more seriously when those brief reminders come in. And I mean, ironically, you find the courage in death or in those sorts of circumstances, to then take on the courage and go pursue the things that you wouldn't normally pursue. So perhaps maybe that's what the necessity of the corpses are. We see the corpses all around us, and the pressure just keeps rising to formulate a better sort of understanding and a better method than what we've been doing here in the West for a very long time. And it. I mean that the
Yeah,
Renaissance came after the
I
plague.
believe there's something beautiful with death in
Yeah.
the sense that, to my experience, from what I've seen, it is this wake up bell And you can
Yeah.
observe that people that are usually very attached to the mundane, after
Yeah.
a person has passed away in the family or a friend, as you said, there is a
Hmm.
time period where they kind of wake up, escape from the matrix just for a little while. You can sense it on
Yeah.
how they speak, how
Yeah.
their presence feels. All of a sudden, that um, maddening grasping to things which are completely insubstantial gets
Yeah.
loosened, and they get a broader view. Now, the good thing with theurgy, tantra, and other contemplative traditions is that you can have this flash of broader view without
Hmm.
actually having to go through the process of having a person near to you dying, and you have not cultivated enough maturation to process such an
Right.
event in a way that it is not very heavy on you, or you yourself having perhaps a very serious accident or coming close to dying. You can have
Right.
that flash of broadening view with theurgic rituals, with tantric sadhanas, with getting into touch with your subtle body, the deeper aspects of your mind, which are already there. They just wait for the right stimulus to be,
That's a great word.
yeah, yeah, to be noticed. They're already operating, they're already active, and perhaps
Right.
your depression, your chronic anxiety, that undefined feeling that something's just not right in your life, perhaps that's your enlightened nature calling you back
Yeah.
home.
I think from all the work that I've done, um, when it comes to looking into the biography of individuals, it is almost exclusively from that wound that the light shines in. I think that's a Rumi quote or something to that
Mhm.
nature. That Jung has a breakdown in 1913, or Nietzsche has his illness that trails him for the remainder of his life and things of that nature. You have Dostoevsky who has the firing squad,
Yeah.
etc., etc. It's in these individual moments of, I mean, well, and obviously his epilepsy as well, where the wound, this problem, is also the catalyst for their great works. In fact, I
Wound
would go as
becomes
far as to say
wound,
that
right?
and you can't separate both the wound and the genius. And
Hmm.
so, for those listening, perhaps the wound that you are experiencing is a good thing to interrogate, because your gift, your work is probably laying in wait for you in exactly that place. That's an hour, my friend. That hour flew by. I know you've got a busy day. I don't want to keep you for too long. Um, would you like to wrap things up there, and we'll do?
Well, I can perhaps answer one last question if you have something in
Please.
mind.
Um, okay, let me check my notes and I will see. In fact, there's one question I did want to ask. Let me get that one.
Sure.
Um, Here, so despite coming at this from really different directions, you obviously through the direct and initiatic experience, and I'm coming from the historical pattern and corresponds, we've landed in a lot of the same territory: the erosion in a strictly mechanistic worldview, process over fixed substance, and the relata problem, imagination as a trained faculty rather than as an idle fancy, which is a very that is perhaps if we ever do a part two, that is something to spend some time on. I'm curious what you make of that convergence itself. Two different people with different methods, similar conclusions. Does that feel like sort of a confirmation of the same underlying idea, or do you want to hold that a little bit more carefully?
For me, I think it is a confirmation that whenever somebody has a genuine interest to connect with his authentic presence, his authentic
Hmm.
nature, the unfabricated self, not the conditioned self that was created by societal conditions and events that may have traumatized us. I
Hmm.
think there are certain qualities that emerge through that quest that are perennial. And although that statement does have a heavy gravitas, right? Like,
Hmm.
what's the proof about that, Odysseus? From my study of many initiatic traditions, worldwide traditions, it does seem to me that they point to the same lived experience, and it does seem to me, at least, that there are certain neurophenomenological findings that also point towards that direction. When it comes, for
Hmm.
example, the work of Daniel J. Siegel, he has founded a field called interpersonal neurobiology. It does
Hmm.
seem that whenever people get this sense of lived meaning, of integration, of happiness, not in the superficial sense, more so in the sense that the ancient Greeks would say eudaimonia, which is
Hmm.
this, it's hard to explain this in English, but it's that kind of bliss that is tied into being itself. It's not the bliss that you feel whenever, I don't know, your football team wins in a mundial or something, right?
Right. Right. That's a good
And
example.
yes, it does seem to me that there is like a perennial structure into that.
Right. And I think I'm in agreement that there is something in that, to your point of being able to come and converge at a similar point across similar lived experience and follow that train of thought in whatever line that it might necessarily be at. And obviously there'll be some individual differences on pathway, on in just general interest, things of that nature, but to arrive at that final conclusion of the embodied, the relational, that conscious as a primary and a mediating force for everything, that you cannot have anything without it. It's a primordial substance, if you will. And so I
And just
agree very much.
comment on what you said about the relational, right?
Yeah,
For all things to be relational, it means that things themselves are unique. They're fully themselves because a
absolutely.
relationship entails that self completeness, if you will, this self
Right.
perfection, that you're fully yourself because things are relational, and because you're fully yourselves, things can be relational. Because you asked me earlier, for example,
Mhm.
how can there be only structure? How can there only be relation without something grounding it? And that's
Right.
the paradox of existence. That's the paradox of the one that also Plato examined in his dialogue Parmenides, that the one, when it manifests itself, when it exists, it is also many. It
Right.
cannot not be many when the one exists. But if the many exist groundless of the one, then
Hmm.
they're unintelligible. And
Right.
that is so simple, but in those axioms, you have the whole mystery of existence encapsulated. That
Absolutely.
simultaneous, incomprehensible relation with the whole and the simultaneous uniqueness of our individual
Right.
existence. There's never going to
And
be someone exactly like you at any given moment, or
right.
myself, or anybody else that is out there.
Right. It, this moment will never exist ever for the rest of time that all exists ever. And yet it seems to generate itself from one source. It's unbelievable. It is unbelievable. It's the axiom is so simple, and to that exact point, that for me to recognize you and vice versa, you would have to be different from me in a unique sense, or else I would just register myself as another form, and yet the underlying structure all seems to be identical, and yet the multiplicity of form arises out of that. It's man,
Precisely.
it's it's I think if we're both speechless on that axiom, that's probably the perfect place to wrap it up. Well,
I believe
sir,
so.
I've had a fantastic time. I hope you have as well. It's been
Yes, I must,
absolute
truly.
pleasure to talk to you. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Is there anything you want to share with the people? Essays to read, places to find you, that kind of thing?
Yes, I do have a page in Substack called Logos and Dharma, and the YouTube channel. as well as a Telegram channel. They all have the same name, Logos
Yeah.
and Dharma.
Okay. Well, I will make sure that I link that both on Substack and YouTube once this goes up. And hopefully we can find some time to do this again because this was an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely. Let's run this back.
All right, my friend. Thank you so much. You take care and we'll talk soon.
Take care. Bye bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.